Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Mary Price, the Events and Marketing Director at the Shingo Institute at Utah State University, and I'm thrilled to have Peter Hines as our guest today. Peter is one of the Institute's faculty fellows, and he's been recognized in several other ways by the Institute as well. He's going to be talking about a research article that he and several others collaborated on. The article is titled A Global Industrial Perspective on Lean Industry 4.0, and it was published in the Production Planning and Control Journal just last month. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for you to refer to today's session. Peter, thank you so much for taking time to share with us today, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. Those of you that are not familiar with me, I'm based in the UK, but I'm also a faculty fellow at the Shingo Institute and a visiting professor at the Southeast Technological University in Ireland, and its spin-out company, SCTU LI4. I've done a number of publications, as Mary alluded to in her introduction, some of which are situated in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at the combination of lean or enterprise excellence with the digitization, or outside the US, certainly in Europe, we tend to call it Industry 4.0, being the fourth industrial revolution for organizations. So what I've done in this slide is I've extended the Shingo bridge that we're familiar with, the middle part and the right-hand part being, if you like, the tools and methods of Lean or Six Sigma or Agile, operational excellence, for example, with the more cultural and leadership side. But I think it's increasingly relevant to add the digitization or smart or Industry 4.0, whatever we'd like to call it, on the left-hand side. And in the same way that there's a broken bridge between the right-hand side and the center, there's a broken bridge between the center and the left-hand side. So what we've decided to do is actually to explore this in some detail. So in terms of the research, we originally, a group of 5 or 6 of us, we actually contacted the 300 most cited academics in this subject area globally, and we asked their viewpoint. And from that, we got 85 responses, and we had a viewpoint looking at the academics. And that's something we did a few years ago, and I'm not reporting on that today. But then with that group of people, I then invited them to take part in finding out what industry thought. So of those, 33 people took part, academics around the world, and we got over 1,000 sample of over 1,000 industry perspectives on integrating enterprise excellence with digitization or lean Industry 4.0. So this is the team of people. As you can see, it's quite a long list. The first 2 from Australia, UK, Mexico, Ireland, etc., etc. And also the Shingo Institute took part in this. Helen Zag, who's just retired from the Institute, and 200 of the responses were from Shingo, if you like, on the mailing list. So maybe you were one of those people. So thank you very much for taking part. So what we found from the survey was that the digitization, or the Industry 4.0, was following a very similar pattern to the lean evolution that had happened probably over the last 30 or 40 years. And that if you look at the penetration of Industry 4.0 tools and methods, it was very similar in terms of the phasing of that we had with lean. So what you can see from this chart is in the blue is the lean, and in the red is the Industry 4.0. And you can see most organizations taking part were in the manufacturing and operations side, and then it extended to logistics, operations, the office side, supply chain, and areas like product development. So you can see that the same curve is exactly the same for the Industry 4.0. So very much following the same trend. What we also found through the survey was not only were we following the same trend, but we were making exactly the same mistakes that the lean folk had done on their evolution of that, and concentrated far too much on the tools and techniques, and not enough on the cultural and leadership side. In other words, the right-hand side of the bridge that I talked about a little bit earlier. And we can't possibly look at every single thing that every single question in the short time that we have for this webinar. But what you can see is that the barriers for applying Lean Industry 4.0, the largest of the barriers was actually financial, but most of the top ones are actually to do with people, change, culture, engagement, and competency. So actually, it wasn't so much the barriers we didn't technically know what to do. It was actually in terms of how do we do that. But what we found from the large survey was that actually it depended a little bit where you start. So we compared with the sample organizations. We did a maturity assessment in terms of lean maturity and in terms of digitization maturity. And what you can see is that there is no huge pattern. Maybe there's a slight, as you get higher in lean, you get higher in digitization, but there isn't a strong correlation. So we actually divided this up into 4 different segments. So in the bottom left-hand corner, early stage, in other words, not very mature on either. Lean Industry 4.0 was, if you like, quite mature on both sides of things. And obviously Industry 4 were people doing the digitization, not lean. And in the same way, lean was high on lean and not so much on digitization. So we then looked at the data and said, well, for these different segments, what do they see as the barriers in terms of going the next step? And what you can see is that the people that are the most furthest ahead doing the Lean Industry 4.0, and it was high in both areas, it was actually financial. So maybe they'd done the easy approaches, and what they realized that they needed to use some more sophisticated tools and techniques. In other words, they'd used lean to take the waste out, they digitized, and maybe they used some more advanced methods and so forth. And people at the beginning of the journey were probably looking at, well, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do, it's going to cost a lot of money. So they were seeing financial was high. People that were high on lean very much saw that actually the biggest barrier was actually about change and change management, actually taking people on the journey. And people that were highest on the Industry 4.0 and not doing lean, and this is the point that I was making earlier, they hadn't really focused on, if you like, the culture, the leadership. So they were seeing the engagement involvement of people, which was a statistically significant result. In other words, what we were saying was that people doing this were probably from a more technical side, maybe engineering people, and perhaps some of the cultural and people side came less readily to them in terms of the engagement and involvement. A similar pattern comes out for enablers, and in fact, the biggest enabler of moving forward was actually the methods of Industry 4.0, the different technologies. But as you can see, the second, third, and fourth areas were much more around the culture, the people side. So in other words, again, there was some element of the tools and techniques. Mostly the issues were around actually the change management. But again, it depends very much where you start. So actually, those people who were either at the beginning stages, the bottom left, the bottom top right, were actually looking at the tools and techniques. People that were, again, looking at high on the Industry 4.0, not on the lean, again, the engagement and the involvement. And people who were high and lean was interesting. The biggest result was actually no answer. In other words, they didn't know what they didn't know. They didn't really know what they needed to do, and hence the answer is we don't know. So actually, that became a very interesting answer in itself. And we also looked at the roles of different people, senior leaders, frontline leaders, and frontline workers. So using Shingo language, this would be leader, manager, and associate. And actually, what were the most important roles? So this was for the senior leader, it was supporting the lean industry 4.0, so getting behind it, adding it in to the strategic direction. So it not being an afterthought, if you like, done by middle management, but actually was part of the strategy organization and approving the budgets for this. For the middle managers, very much about understanding and being trained and learning about this themselves and training others, and then focusing on implementing this and actually creating and managing the data. And for the frontline or the associates, very much the implementation, learning about this and managing the data were actually the most important roles. And we asked each of the respondents, we asked what were in terms of competencies, in terms of what are the most important things that we actually do. And actually the most important thing for each of the three levels of the organization was actually around as leadership. So we clustered it in leadership. So for senior people, it was understanding what it was. So like any other thing, maybe senior leaders a little bit embarrassed. They don't perhaps know as much about this as some of the newer digital age people coming into the workforce today. So actually understanding what it was, otherwise you tend to say no. Understanding the methods and the role that you need to play, and gaining your own buy-in and actually the buy-in of others in the organization and the commitment to drive this. And then actually sponsoring it, promoting it, communicating the importance, being involved in the training and leading by example and supporting it in terms of how you operate your leader standard work. So in terms of frontline leaders, the middle managers, understanding what it was the leadership area, what are the methods, what is the role that you have, and then promoting it, training others, and it being part of some of your leader standard work. And for the frontline associates, it was very much understanding what it is, learning about it, and understanding your role. So those were the most important areas. In terms of competencies, we asked what were the most important competencies. So in all this questionnaire, it was quite a complex piece of work because instead of saying, well, here are the 5 options, which one's the most important, or rank them 1 to 5, we had an open question. So people could type in their own responses, and then we coded it and clustered it into different areas. So in this one, what we found was that if you look at this pie chart, the largest area in terms of competencies was around behavior and mindset, which very much puts you in mind of some of the sort of work that the Shingo Institute has done on the right-hand side of the bridge. And very much what was most important after that was actually various elements of change management, strategy, etc. Whereas the different methods and tools and techniques of Lean and Industry 4.0 only came out as about 1 in 7. So in other words, probably something like 2/3 were actually to do with change management, people, culture, and so forth, which actually comes as a little bit of a surprise to us in terms of we thought it would be all about using the tools and understanding technology and understanding how to manage the data and so forth. but actually not really that at all. So this has implications in terms of the education community, consulting community. It has implications in terms of what industry does in terms of understanding and not repeating the mistakes of going for the technology for the sake of the technology. So as we conclude some of the results, we asked the companies what support did they need. So what support did they need from outside the organization? And as you can see, the most important factors on the left-hand side here was very much about training and education. So this ranged from, if you like, very short, half day, maybe awareness raising of understanding what it's about, right through to undergraduate or master's degrees or PhDs, understanding, raising awareness and gaining knowledge, sharing experiences of this through across organizations, implementation support, consulting support maybe, and having different case studies to learn what others have done. And in the Industry 4.0, the term that's used is use cases rather than case studies. So in other words, these were the most important areas. And what you can see, we then asked them, well, who should provide this support? So what you can see here is that the response was very much a combination of people, government agencies, consulting, university, academia, technology providers, for example. And this did depend a little bit on the country in terms of the governmental role. Much stronger governmental role was seen in Europe than, for instance, in North America, for example. But actually a combination of these different types. And what we saw very much was it did depend on the level of maturity. So if the level of maturity was low, it was more about awareness raising. If the level of maturity was medium high, it was more around case studies and experience sharing. That were some of the key things. So in terms of conclusion of this session, what we can see is that Industry 4.0 or digitization follows the same path as lean, not necessarily dependent on lean, but actually we found that the most advanced organizations, 78% of those did lean before Industry 4.0. That seemed to be the most effective way of doing it. Otherwise, many people raised the question of digitizing the waste if you actually don't remove the waste first. So the third conclusion was that Industry 4 classifications tend to be in terms of clusterings of different types of technology. For instance, wireless sensors or virtual reality, augmented reality, for example, as different clusters, or cloud computing, for example, as different clusters. We actually felt from this that the evolution would be better of saying, well, we automate first, we digitize second, and the role of the team leader was quite important, not just the technology. So actually the manager, the middle manager was quite important in this evolution. And some of you might have heard the term Industry 5.0, which in our mind is Industry 4.0 and some of the bits of lean that were missed out, but not all the bits of lean. So in other words, Industry 5 doesn't quite have all the aspects that it should in terms of strategy, leadership, and change management that we were actually pointing to in this survey. But actually, if there is a fifth industrial revolution, it is the AI in our perspective. So what we found was that the terms Industry 4.0 or digitization or smart was far from a universal approach. And actually, in terms of some of the research areas that the academic community had been looking, for instance, customer perspective, supply chain, sustainability, and resilience. There's quite a lot of research in those areas. This is not terms that were mentioned a lot by industry. Now, that could be that industry is not yet ready to realize that it needs to focus on that, or it could be that this is something that academics are interested that hasn't got such a usage in terms of industry. So it could be either of those or a combination of those. So really, that there's a lot of academic interest in linking lean and industry 4.0, and lean does seem to be very much people could see what lean is. Maybe we have different definitions, but we know roughly what it is. Industry 4.0 digitization really wasn't a very distinct as a unit. It wasn't a we'll do all the same things. And doing the lean and industry 4.0 together was very much a piecemeal approach. There seemed to be, although there were maturity assessments which had been used by developed by academics or consultancies, for example, there were very few organizations that were following that path or benchmarking where they were. The interesting thing, and this has actually come out of some of our work, research work that's more general than this in terms of applying enterprise excellence, was the mindset, behaviors, competency, change, and leadership aspects really seem to be the key aspects that differentiate the best organizations from the typical organization. So a final thought to leave you with is this actually takes us back. So instead of saying the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the bridge and the center that we looked about, think about the bridge joining up. So if you like, a bit like a train for a toy train where you have a circular track going round and round. And actually the biggest divide was actually between the cultural side or the right-hand side of the bridge and the digitization or industry 4.0. So it was this divide and this join that actually would be the biggest point. And some separate research that we did, we actually looked at to what degree did the Shingo model. We also looked at the Baldrige model. We also looked at EFQM, which would be the European equivalent of that. And we found that although the language had developed a Baldrige and EFQM that was much more in industry 4.0 friendly than some of the Shingo approach, that actually some of the Shingo approach to the cultural side, which is at the center of the Shingo model, was much more applicable and appropriate for applying a technology approach. So our feeling from this was actually that if you combine some of the Shingo approach with the digitization, you actually get a much more favorable journey for lean industry 4.0 than if you like, if you didn't have the standard, you use the standard lean approach. So that's the end of my presentation. So I hope that's been useful for you. If you feel you want to follow up on any comments, send a note to me, peter@enterpriseexcellence.com. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed that. As Mary said, there is a link to the paper that's available. So if you want to read the academic study themselves, please feel free to do so. Thank you. Goodbye.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. We do have a few questions. If you have a few minutes, we could go through those.
Yes, of course.
Perfect. Okay. First question, what elements of Industry 4.0 have been considered in the research, and is it all elements?
Yes. When we looked at Industry 4.0, we took some of the definitions that were already made, and nearly every definition was a cluster of different technologies. So we actually took one approach which actually had 9 different clusters of technology. So AI would be one cluster, wireless centers would be another, for instance. And so we actually were taking a very wide range of view. And separate to what I've presented here, we actually looked at the maturity of these different technologies. So we found Internet of Things and cloud computing being the furthest ahead in terms of, and these are some of the technologies that we use with our smartphones without realizing we're actually using some of these technologies. So it's probably not surprising that those were most common.
Thank you. Next question. This person asks, what's the difference between Industry 4.0 and Lean Industry 4.0?
Okay, so the difference here, Industry 4.0 is we could look at that as digitization, or technically speaking, Industry 4.0 is where you have digitization with digital communication. So this is like the wireless sensors or remote sensing, for example. So that's the Industry 4.0. So the smart, the digitization, and so forth. Lean Industry 4.0 is the combining with the lean and the digitization, putting both of those together. So this is a term that's now quite widely used, certainly in the academic community, in terms of bringing these two areas together.
Thank you. Next question. In your opinion, what is the most effective way to integrate AI into a continuous improvement environment?
Well, that is a very interesting question, and one that is exercising a lot of minds at the moment. In fact, working in the SCTU Lean Industry 4 Centre in Ireland, we found that probably it's one of the top two questions. So what do we do with, we're doing lean, how do we use AI? How do we bring those two together? The answer to that is probably twofold. So the first part is there's some easy to use, very accessible AI tools like ChatGPT that we're all familiar with that you can actually apply. You can write reports, you can save a lot of time on that. And in fact, one of my friends who worked for one of the digital companies, he's coming from a Lean Six Sigma perspective, and he was saying that thinking about the using Minitab and so forth for for a lot of the hard work in terms of the black belt work that's being done, that actually you didn't need to do that. You just put it into one of these AI engines and it spits out an answer straight away. So he was finding that actually you don't need to do a lot of the technical work. So that, if you like, could be leaned out. So he was saying, well, I don't need 2/3 of my people, but wait a minute. Actually, what I do need them for is the change management, the leadership, and the cultural change stuff that we haven't been doing enough of. And so very much the same message that lean or enterprise excellence have, focus on the cultural side, and even more so. So that was probably the main thing in terms of AI. But actually, I think we're scratching the surface of where AI is going to take us in terms of it's going to be a huge change for organizations as we go forward.
I agree with that. One last question. Do you have examples of how the Shingo principles can be integrated in a digital environment?
Yes, it's an interesting question, that one. Thank you for asking that. What we found was that separate to this, with the colleagues at the Shingo Institute, we've been editing a special issue of an academic journal called International Journal of Lean Six Sigma. And 40% of the papers that have been submitted to that journal are actually looking at integrating Shingo with the Industry 4.0. So we didn't specifically say write us papers on this, but 40% of what was coming in was actually saying, how does these fit together? And there's a range of views on that. One of those is a study that actually of one of a Shingo Prize winning organization who actually gone quite far on this digital Industry 4.0 journey. And what they were suggesting is that maybe we should even change or adapt some of the principles that actually would bring in the digitization um, into the Shingo principle themselves. But actually, a lot of the principles would stand. Um, I suppose a personal opinion is probably again the viewpoint is that there's 10 principles and two around culture. My feeling is that maybe there should be eight around culture and two about other things, but maybe that's going too far. So I think there's some question, there's some research work to be done in terms of how does the Shingo Institute and the Industry 4.0 fit together. But actually, I think the essence of the Shingo principles would apply to the digital world as much as actually the physical world as well.
Perfect. All right. Well, those are all the questions that we have. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time today. I hope each of the attendees enjoyed the session, and we'll see you again next month.